Alright, so this is Immigrant Struggles in America, and we're going to have 20 minutes for each speaker here to talk, and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A, so if you have a question as they're speaking, write it down, and we'll take stack and give you a chance to ask it. Okay, so I'll first introduce Silvia Giagnoni. This is on the far end of me right here. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Dramatic Arts at Auburn University, Montgomery. She's a writer, documentary filmmaker, and producer, and the author of Field of Resistance, The Struggle of Florida Farm Workers for Justice, or Florida Farmers Justice, yeah, about the people of Milwaukee, Florida. And she writes and publishes in both English and Italian. And right now she's most recently published a two-part feature story in Italian titled The Mystery Beyond the Hedge, Monroeville, Harper Lee, and the 50th anniversary of To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's, yeah, and she's currently working on a book on new immigrants in Alabama. And to my immediate right here is Audrey Sasson. She's a founding member of Community Farmworker Alliance, New York City, formerly Fair Food, New York. It's a collective that works in solidarity with the Coalition for Milwaukee Workers to advance their campaign for fair food. She also serves on the boards of Jews for Radical and Economic Justice.
Racial
Justice. Just reading them, sorry. And,
radical.
Yeah. And Brand Workers International. And she's been involved in various working groups from Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started then.
All right. Well, first of all, welcome. Something that, as immigrants, I always like to do, as an immigrant myself. What I'll talk today about is primarily the organizing efforts in Alabama, actually, although I did write a book about Immigrant. Organizing efforts, especially after the passing of HB 56, now called HB 658, which, as you might know, is the anti-immigration bill that was passed 2 years ago in Alabama. Is one of the, well, it's considered the worst in the nation. I have a couple of things to pass around, but first of all, I wanted to say something about the law. As I said, it was conceived to be the most effective at targeting all aspects. Actually, I'm using the words of one of the sponsors of the bill. The sponsors were Scott Bison and Mickey Hammond, obviously two Republican representatives of the Alabama House. So attack every aspect of an undocumented immigrant's life in the U.S. And I'm using undocumented immigrants. They don't use that term, but use, as you know, they use the term illegal alien or illegals, whatever. And the reason why it was that way is because the bill was really conceived to make the life of any undocumented immigrant so difficult. And the worst problem, even worse than the intention, I guess, of the bill was that it was very vaguely framed, so it led to a lot of misunderstandings and abuses in the application and the implementation of the law. Some of these abuses have been documented by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They actually, I'm passing these around too. I want this back though. This is Alabama's shame. There are some of the stories about the abuses of the people had. For instance, there was one of the provisions of the law talked about how as an undocumented immigrant you could not enter a contract with any sorts of state entities, and so people in some cases could not get water. People, literally, water got turned off because that was interpreted as applying like into a contract. This was a misinterpretation of the law. But again, it was so vaguely phrased that it could have been interpreted that way, but there were people who suffered. That this is one of the stories in there, that for 40 days were without waters, and people with kids, and so something that obviously, and that's, of course, it attacks like the everyday life. Then obviously you know about the infamous provision that deals with the racial profiling, although it doesn't say that it's okay to racial profile, obviously, but you could be stopped and asked if the agent has suspect that you're in the country legally. Basically, you could be asked for your papers, and so that leads to all sorts of obviously potential abuses, and money have been spent in training, trying to train police officers and IC agents, and to deal with that and do that correctly and for whatever that means. So this was a provision that actually, when the Supreme Court struck some of the provisions of the Arizona law, this was kept. So this is still into place. I mean, this is something that is still happening, and obviously there's a hotline that people can call to report abuses, and this is an effort. Of course, the SPLC, by its other organizations, they have done a lot of work in this sense to protect the rights, the basic rights of immigrants in Alabama. Now, as you might know, this was a bill conceived by Chris Kovalick and backed by FAIR and the Heritage Foundation, a series of very conservative anti-immigration organizations. And Chris Kovalick is currently the Secretary of State of Kansas, who could not pass a similar bill in Kansas, but he has exported this model into several states, and Georgia being another one, obviously in the South. Now, Chris Kovalick has become this sort of champion of intolerance in America. That's how I like to see him, because it's not just infamous for anti-immigration law. He has, when he was working with the Department of Justice under Ashcroft, he has passed a very discriminatory legislation that would require fingerprinting for citizens who were on a visa in this country from Middle Eastern countries or Muslims in general. This was finally struck down in 2011, but it was in place for several years, and it was him who conceived that. Then he's a proponent of the famous ID laws, the voting rights, changing requiring a voter an ID to show an ID at the voting polls, at the polls, and he proposed to change legislations in the name of equality among states. Now, you might know that there are states who have a history of racial discriminations, like Alabama, for instance, where you actually have to go through the federal government. You have to clear. There's they have to, in a sense, ask for permission to the federal government to change their voting laws. And in the name of equality among states and freedom, this is great. I mean, the use of language is where you really need to, I think as leftists, we really need to do work on, obviously in reappropriating the language of the civil rights movement also. But it's really the idea is to, why do we have to ask the federal government for permission? So it's still like this heritage, Confederate heritage of, we're the proponents of states' rights, right? Anyway, so he was able to do this in Alabama, where a state in which, this is not Arizona. This you have in the last 10, 15 years, there's been the immigrants population in general has skyrocketed. But we're still talking about 5%, actually 3.5% of foreign born is the latest census of 2010. Is actually 4.9 the state's workforce that is made of immigrants, so it's actually the labor is higher. But we're talking about, this is the Pew Hispanic Center, a 120,000 estimate of undocumented immigrants. That's what we're talking about. But again, it's still minor. I mean, it's really a minority, and that's why it's even more vulnerable, you know. And besides, obviously, already being undocumented. So there have been the proponents of the law, and the governor was being very not so much at the beginning, but then kind of defensor of this bill. Very outspoken. I'm sorry, they have really sold this bill as an anti-legality bill more than an anti-immigrants bill, and that's something that unfortunately they've been quite successful at doing that. Even though, despite the fact that, I mean, this is just mere observation, so I haven't done a study on that, but it seemed to me, even talking to the organizers and the media, the local media, the way they covered, especially the newspapers, but also I've been told the local TV stations, they've been pretty anti-HB 56. They've been supportive of the immigrant organizations that have done work in this sense. So what I wanted to talk about specifically, and then again we can obviously, we'll have time for questions. The organization that was founded and has done a lot of work in terms of organizing the immigrants in Alabama, which, as I said, is such a small percentage of the population, is the Alabama Coalition for Immigrant Justice. And I have some, actually, before. I can pass both of these around, actually. This is a membership, in case you want to support them. And this is actually more information about the HB 56 and what provisions are still in effect, and kind of a Q&A section on that. So this coalition was actually founded in 2006, and it was primarily a legal advocacy group at that time, but then and I'm reading here from their website, it was founded to defend immigrants' rights in the wake of increased anti-immigrant legislation being proposed at local and state levels, because, you know, the different, you know, ordinances, and I mean, it's been several years, and it's just not the last 2 or 3 years that happened all over the country, actually. But obviously, after the organization was galvanized after 2011, after in June the law was passed, and in September it got into effect. So they have, in their steering committee, there's the ACLU of Alabama, the NAACP of Alabama has been very supportive. They form an Immigrant Youth Leadership Initiative of Alabama. It's basically the Dreamers, and they've been very active, actually, a pivotal component. There's Greater Birmingham Ministries, there's SPLC, there's Auburn Public Law Center, and then there are individuals, amazing individuals, like I have to mention Ellen Rivas in Birmingham, and I don't know if the people from Birmingham are here, but she's just amazing, and the work that she does is really indefatigable. But then, so what happened after the law passed, and this is also thanks to the organizing efforts, the groups formed throughout Alabama, and so the coalition, I'll refer that as the coalition, have tried to build alliances, and kind of since last year they've been meeting every month, so they meet in every, different cities and just, towns in Alabama. To discuss, strategies, and I'll get to talk about the objectives of that. But, the immigrant communities are primarily concentrated in the north and in the greater Birmingham areas. But now in Montgomery, where I live, there are a lot of immigrants as well. We have, we're talking about a growing also Asian community, so it's not just Latinos. So we're talking about Asian communities, especially because of we have a big Hyundai plant in Montgomery. So it's kind of different class. I mean, we're talking about usually, but you do have a lot of actually also of undocumented immigrants. They're Asians, and they have not been organized. That's the other thing. That's kind of one of the limits of the coalition, that they haven't been able to reach out beyond the Latino communities. So right now, they're focused on building leadership in all these immigrant communities, so trying to identify leaders, and you have leaders. I was at a meeting back in November in Montgomery, and so in these meetings, obviously you strategize, but then they go back to the community, they try to be representatives in their communities. So primarily, talk to law enforcement, the mayor, business leaders, elected officials, and try to say, okay, we are here. Okay, so we're not invisible. That's the main thing, because as I said, it's already and that's one kind of the premises of kind of what I'm working in my book, is this idea of in the absence of direct contact with the immigrants, stereotyping flourish, and so you have flourishes. So you have a lot of stereotyping. People and this is very interesting in terms of kind of southern. Think about the southern hospitality, and people are, for instance, very nice to me. I've been there almost for 5 years, and but we like queue, but they don't like groups. I mean, it's kind of that's these dynamics. But because until they know the person, so that's important to encourage that direct contact. And this is in any contest, obviously, because you get to know and you get to talk to people, understand their difficulties, and most people, obviously they're not obviously criminals. They're people that are just working people, and they came here to improve their lives. So the focus also on the coalition, another one of the objectives have been alliance building. As I said, they have just connected at the regional level with the Fair Immigration Reform Immigration Movement firm, with the Southeast Immigrant Rights Network. Now with the firm, they're part of the Keeping Families Together, which is actually a project about telling, where immigrants tell their stories, and so they kind of being trained. Actually this weekend they were having a training, kind of even with a cell phone, just to film yourself and be able to tell your story in 3 minutes, and kind of to help put pressure on comprehensive immigration reform. That's kind of the main focus right now, whereas up until last year, the main focus was state, put pressure on the state to seek for the repeal of the law. Now, right now, they have shifted their focus, and they're more focusing on that. I can talk then about other limits so far. Of course, they have limited resources. That's why they're always looking for new members and supporters. I can talk about the challenges, but I think I'm going to close here and just, I think, we'll have more time.
Oh, it's loud. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm Audrey Sasson, and I am really happy to be here. I was at the YDS conference 4 years ago as a participant, I think, and I found out then that I had already aged out. So, so I've been admiring the YDS from afar, but I'm really happy to be here. Actually, like Silvia, I'm also an immigrant. I'm originally from Canada, but I've been here for about 8 years, and I'm going to talk today about the work I've done in the U.S. related to immigrant worker justice, most specifically related to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Has anyone here heard about them? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, great, awesome. But I also, just to put it out there, that I'm also on the board of Brand Workers, which was mentioned in the bio. Brand Workers is a local New York City-based organization. Anyone in New York? Are we doing New Yorkers here? A couple New Yorkers. I don't know if you've heard of Brand Workers, but it works on immigrant worker justice workplace campaigns for the food processing and distribution sector here in New York, mostly in Queens, where the bulk of our food that is produced and processed here in New York happens, and it's a largely immigrant workforce and extremely exploited as well. So for me, all of the immigrant worker justice sort of struggles are connected, and happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I just wanted to put out there that that's also my frame and where I come from a little bit. The Community Farmworker Alliance is where I sort of center the work around being in solidarity with the coalition of Immokalee workers. I've been doing that since 2006, and it's a horizontal collective. It's all unpaid. It's just a group of us who live in New York City and who want to support the struggle of farm workers based in Florida, and I'll tell you more about what that struggle looks like. I want to just say that I'm really excited to be here with Silvia, because Silvia actually wrote the book on the CIW, one of many, but this is a really great book. I'm going to pass it around. She's, for some silly reason, only brought one. So if you're the lucky winner, you might be the one to purchase the book, and if you don't, then I will. So what is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers? Those of you who know, anyone want to say who they are, what they do? Yeah?
It's a coalition of farm workers in Florida. I think it's all tomato pickers.
Mm-hmm.
And they organize to get better prices directly with the companies like Taco Bell and Trader Joe's that purchase from them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it'll be like a 2-cent increase in like the per batch
Exactly.
price, but it like makes a huge difference in whether they're working for like slave wages or whether they can feed their families, and they've been like really successful.
They have been really successful, which is why we decided I would go second, because they're an uplifting story of social change. And I learned about them for the first time when I was doing my graduate degree at Columbia, and I was looking for a project to social movements topic, and I had to find an example of a successful social movement organization. So I found the CIW, and I basically, got hooked. That was 6 years ago or whatever it was, 7 years ago. But they're a community-based organization. They're in Southwest Florida. They're in the town of Immokalee, a very hard word to pronounce, but once you get it, you get it. There are about 4,000 members, mostly Haitian, Mexican, Guatemalan origin. Many undocumented and otherwise. They're mixed in terms of their legal status. And they are working to improve their working conditions through this very innovative approach, which I'll tell you guys more about, but which you rightly pointed to. Among their other accomplishments is that they've worked with the Department of Justice to uncover and prosecute 6 cases of modern-day slavery in the fields of Florida. So they look at slavery as sort of one end of the spectrum, and they basically their approach is that the reason slavery exists in the fields of Florida today, real slavery, not sort of a metaphor for slavery, is because workers are so in need of protection, and they have none. They have zero protection in the field. So they see it as sort of a part of a bigger campaign to improve working conditions. I'm going to mostly talk about their campaign for fair food as opposed to their anti-slavery work, but sort of they are all connected. And one thing I want to just say is that they are not a union. They're sort of a worker-centered sort of thing. And they are really at the forefront of a different way of organizing workers in the U.S. And a lot of the labor movement has looked to the CIW as sort of, how did they do that? That's really amazing. Like, we should sort of think through their approach, because it's not directly engaging with employers. It's sort of thinking about our global economy and how do we plug in, given this sort of the balance of power, how do we shift that power? So the relationship that I have, I'm not a member of the CIW. I work with this group called the Community Farmworker Alliance, and we see ourselves very much as a solidarity group, an allied group, and in the spirit of the way the CIW organizes, they don't ask for supporters. Actually, they even distinguish supporters from allies. They don't ask for supporters, they don't ask for sympathizers, they don't ask for any charity or pity. They ask for partners and allies, and for them that's really, really key, because they want their allies to feel like they have a stake in what they're doing, and that they're not just sort of doing this because the CIW, needs their help. They do this, I do this work because I want to see an economy that is not based on exploitation, and that is actually a value to me, and that is, I have a stake in that. That's important to me. So that's the way we do our work, and that's how the CIW kind of really insists that anyone who works alongside them thinks through it that way. So what are they trying to change? What's the problem in Florida's agricultural sector? I'm going to speak mostly about that sort of struggle to improve their working conditions, and I want to sort of distinguish that from their struggle being an immigrant rights struggle. They don't really frame their work as an immigrant rights struggle, even though they're mostly immigrants. They really see the power of organizing as workers, and I think that that's really important in the current context in the South. Actually, I'm curious about whether Florida, I think at one point Florida was also looking into one of these laws. I don't know if it has passed.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, there was, I think in 2011 actually, but
Yeah,
they
it didn't go.
It was an organization, I think it was called We Are Florida or Somos Florida, and they were able to stop.
They were,
well, at least, you know.
for now.
Yeah.
So for now, they don't have to deal with that, which is really
Yeah.
great, and they are able to focus their struggle on the worker struggle. They do have a position on the guest worker program, which is one of these programs to bring agricultural workers here and tie their status to their work. I'm here on an H-1B. My status is tied to my work as well, but it's not quite as vulnerable. And so I just want to read what they have to say about that, because it is one of the few places where they sort of weigh in on the immigration debate. So they say, not surprisingly, guest worker programs have been tried before, and they have failed miserably, often with tragic consequences. Between 1942 and 1964, for example, millions of Mexican workers were imported under an agricultural guest worker program known as the Bracero program to work temporarily under contract to U.S. growers and ranchers. The program was scuttled in 1964 after years of scandalous labor abuses. Europe, too, experimented with guest worker programs, which also ended in failure years ago. Abuses such as those that eventually killed the Bracero program are inevitable, as the guest worker relationship is an extremely coercive form of labor relations. As a guest worker, not only does your employer hold your livelihood in his hands, but he also holds your visa, your very right to be in this country. With so much power concentrated under the employer's control, it is hardly surprising that an inordinate number of recent prosecutions for modern-day slavery and forced labor have involved guest workers, with cases ranging from New Hampshire to American Samoa. Indeed, the president's proposal could well undermine efforts to fight slavery more broadly, as giving employers such wide control over their workers' lives is a proven recipe for exploitation. I dug that up yesterday when I was looking for talking points, because I knew that Silvia was going to talk about immigration, and I wasn't, but I wanted to sort of put that out there, that it is one way in which the CIW thinks about this debate. And one of the reasons they don't really look at this issue, other than sort of taking strong positions on something like the guest worker program, is to them, this is the abuses that farm workers face in Florida's fields and in the fields in general in the South, is part of a long legacy of slavery. It has nothing to do with your status, right? It has to do with just the exclusion from labor law, which is old news. Everyone who here kind of has a sense of farm worker laws and what protects them. Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't speak to it
Okay.
in detail, but I have a vague understanding.
Yeah. So the conditions are bad, and they've always been bad. They didn't become bad because immigrants started to cross the border in 1994, or more of them started to cross in 1994. So they've always been bad. It is a legacy of slavery. Slaves in this country were working in the fields and working in the homes, and in 1930, when they passed the National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s, they excluded domestic workers and farm workers from those protections. So this is not related to people's status. This has to do with a long history of white supremacy and slavery in this country. So the conditions are terrible. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of those conditions. They have no rights. Basically, have zero rights to collective bargaining, to overtime, to any kind of benefits whatsoever, workers' compensation, all of the sort of health and safety concerns. They have no right to any days off or any time off. They're basically no sick days. It's the kind of pretty much horrendous. And because the CIW has been so successful at changing things, I just don't want to dwell too much on those conditions, but they're bad. The only thing I will share is, for you to read at your leisure, is a testimony that Lucas Benitez, who's one of the founding members of the CIW, shared with the Senate in 2008 about the conditions in the fields. And I also stumbled on this yesterday and realized, wow, I'd never read it, but it's really important to hear directly from the farm workers themselves about their experience, and so that's a good opportunity for you to do that since they're not here in this room today. So the slavery thing as well, that I just want to say, I mean, we mentioned that there is slavery in the fields. The CIW has helped to prosecute certain cases. They have also put together this mobile slavery museum and sort of to document the history of slavery in Florida and the modern day slavery in Florida. So I need this back as well, but I think you can download this offline. This is their sort of a really wonderful history of modern day slavery in Florida that the CIW has put together. So I recommend checking it out. So when Lucas Benitez made that statement to the Senate, that was in 2008. Things have not changed in decades. The wages had been stagnant for 30 years. This is not new given global neoliberalism. But in farm worker cases, we're talking about people earning maybe $10,000 a year and having to live off of that. And those wages had, because they remained stagnant and because inflation had gone up, their actually real wages had gone down, right? So if you fast forward to today, so things were really bad. They were bad in 2008. Shortly after that, actually, Burger King signed on to one of these agreements, which was really exciting. But fast forward to today. Today, over 90% of the state's tomato growers are implementing something called a Fair Food Code of Conduct, which marked in 2011 the beginning of something called the Fair Food Program. The Fair Food Program is what the CIW has innovated over the last 10 years, 12 years, and has wrestled power from big corporations and got themselves a seat at the table to actually literally shift the balance of power in that relationship, and allows them to have a whole slew of sort of protections and better conditions. So those changes include a pay increase. You had mentioned, I think, what they were getting paid before. On average, farm workers have been getting paid a piece rate of 50 cents per bucket of tomatoes that they pick. That's 32 pounds of tomatoes for 50 cents for every 32 pounds. And so now with this penny more per pound, or actually a little bit more than a penny more per pound, they're almost doubling their wages, which is ridiculous, but also amazing. So that was their original demand back in 2001, and now they have that plus a code of conduct, which includes zero tolerance for slavery and forced labor. They have CIW education sessions on the farms on company time to ensure that workers understand their rights and the role that the workers get to have in the enforcement of their rights in the fields. This is totally revolutionary. This is not something that anyone would have imagined 10 years ago. They also have health and safety committees, and those committees include workers themselves being part of those committees. They get paid for that time, and that allows them to have a voice in trying to sort of regulate what's going on in the fields in terms of health and safety. So even something as simple as having shade in the fields is something that now they have a right to, and they have an ability to participate in making sure that it happens. So this is radical. It's historic, and this is a booklet that they have that explains the rights that they now have guaranteed based on these legal agreements called that make up the Fair Food Program. So these are booklets that they get to have, and they're in Spanish mostly, but there are some translations for all of us gringos who are trying to follow what's going on. And that tells you a little bit about some of the gains that they've made. So real quick, I just want to say, how did they do it? What did they do to... Do we have time? 5 minutes. Perfect. Okay. So what did they do? They basically, they started in organizing about over 20 years ago, and the first 10 years they'd always been trying to answer the question, why are farm workers poor? That is their question. And 20 years ago, they started, when they were trying to figure that out, they were looking to their employers for help, and they were looking to their employers to change the conditions, as we call them, the growers. And the growers weren't budging. The growers weren't moving. They were really violent in the field, and they were working with subcontractors also who were really violent, and there was really no moving these employers who insisted that there really is nothing that they could do, that their hands were tied. We know that obviously employers can do more than they say usually, but in this case the CIW started to actually do a little bit more research, and they understood when they started to do that research in late 90s, early 2000s, that the fast food industry, that Americans were spending more than $110 billion on fast food, which was up from $6 billion in 1970. So in 30 years, that industry had gained such a huge market share that it was actually changing the market altogether. The agricultural industry was shifting because of the market share that these companies had. And what was happening was that the value of the produce, the value of the production was being passed up the supply chain from the workers to the growers, from the growers up to the corporations, right? And that the profits that the growers were making was shrinking. That was shrinking while the profits of the corporations was growing, the corporations that were purchasing from them. And that was like a very tangible shift. That was like measurable. It was, I think growers went from receiving 40% of the retail price of tomatoes to less than a quarter. So as they're getting squeezed by the corporations, they are sort of squeezing workers right back, right?
It's 5 minutes.
5 minutes for the whole thing.
I guess.
Oh my God. Okay, so the CIW decided they were going to reverse that trend. They were going to say, no, instead of value going up, value is going to come right back down to us, right? And so before the rise of Occupy Wall Street, before sort of all of this sort of revived left, which happened in the last few years, I remember I had been involved in anti-FTAA stuff in the in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then 9/11 happened, everyone kind of went into this deep slumber, and in that time, the CIW was actually setting the groundwork for this incredible strategy where they were going to go directly to the corporate buyers and say, it's up to you to actually pay the money right back down the supply chain because you have a responsibility to do that. They shifted the protest from the point of production to the point of consumption, and they started to work with consumers. And in doing that, they actually they took a risk because that meant that the focus would be on consumers, right? And then therefore the invisibility of the workers was going to remain a problem. If like consumers are saying, oh, Taco Bell, you got to sign this agreement, etc., then the workers themselves are still invisible at the bottom of the supply chain. But they did this incredible work where they developed a national network of allies, and they insisted that their allies working across the country to make these demands of these corporations would not do so by speaking for farm workers, would not do so in a way that would continue to make them invisible, but would raise their visibility and create platforms for them to speak and be out there and to really make their voices heard. And finally, in the end, they got 11 corporations to sign on to these legal agreements. They have the bulk of the fast food industry on board. They start to have supermarkets on board. They have a lot of the food service providers on board, like Sodexo and Aramark, et cetera. And they have a completely innovative way of doing it. So I'll stop there because we have no time for questions, and that's really shitty.
I think we do, actually.
But
it's time to.
It's 12:50. I guess they really want to stand at 12:50.
All right, so I'll stop there, but I just want to say, like, they're really an amazing example of success, of working with allies, and because they framed their problem in a way that allowed them to really reach out to a broad base of support by targeting the economy the way that it's structured and the corporate power the way that it is. They've been able to really galvanize a national effort to to be in solidarity with them.
Yeah, so I guess we really don't have time for questions because we got started 10 minutes late.
I don't understand. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm always very. I mean, we're lunch. Yeah, I mean.
No, but there's also the working class caucus.
By in 10 minutes, I mean, and it's in 10 minutes. It's not
If we
enough.
can come to consensus on staying here for 5 more minutes, we're good.
I mean, whatever.
We can stay for 5 minutes.
All right, 5 minutes, we'll have a question and answer, so I'll start us back.
Here, I'll pass these around if people want to sign up for our listserv.
I guess, what sort of other areas of labor or whatever else do you think that model could be applied to?
I think it could be applied to almost any. I mean, it is being like the work that we're doing with brand workers here in New York City is working with workers worker-led campaigns where the workers themselves are sort of doing their own leadership development work, and they are going after the brands, going after the corporations, and demanding sort of concessions from the corporations at the top of the chain. I think, given the current economy, I think it's applicable to almost any situation. It's kind of like the sweatshop movement, anti-sweatshop movement. Yeah.
We'll go 1, 2.
I know we heard another speaker talk about the actual So I was just wondering if any of the field workers have been able to make alliances with the fast food workers, because I think that's just like a two-tiered,
That's awesome.
force of power to really, shift things.
Well, interestingly, the fast food campaign had come to kind of a close a few years ago, because when we got the last fast food company,
Well, Wendy's now.
right. So now it's back, right? So we had we had closed that chapter, and then Chipotle was sort of really the last nail in the coffin with the fast food industry, and then we're like, oh, actually, Wendy's never signed on, so now we got to get Wendy's. So Wendy's is our current campaign, and because it's just getting started, we're starting to have conversations with Florida around like how do we connect the dots between those struggles, because it's obviously a huge opportunity and an important one.
First of all, thank you for coming. It's kind of a big question, but I'm just wondering, in your ideal world, what American immigration policy would look like?
Oh,
Two immigrants up here deciding that. I would really like to get a green card.
I have a green card, and I got that through my job actually, and that's something that when I met Chris Kobach, actually, he told me, like, how long did it take you? Like, I'm like, a little over a year. Oh, it's too long. I'm like, I'm not complaining. I mean, I know, if you're Mexican, you have your chances of getting a green card are pretty slim, because they're only 5,000 a year, because there's still a quota system. I mean, that depends where you're from. Well, that could be, it's a very complicated. I think you got us down with David Bacon, who just published a new article on Trudeau. You need to start with having a, the socialist, I guess, approach, a very different approach to international trade in general. I mean, obviously, the NAFTA agreement, but not only NAFTA. I mean, there's been several agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Agreement that I've worked on lately. Those are the cause of displacement. So I do believe that you need to do a lot in the country of origins, and people move. And we'll always move. We always migrated. I mean, and they don't move just out of necessity. I'm a firm believer that it's always a choice. There's a different degrees of constraints. Obviously, even when you migrate because of political reasons or your life is at risk, there are people who decide to stay. I mean, it's always a choice at the bottom of it. But so. It's very hard to, obviously, in the comprehensive immigration reform, I am actually in favor of having a system where you do have, if you, there's talking about amnesty, and if you cross the border illegally, specifically, or you came, you do have to pay a fine, because I do think that after all, you did break a law. And so that's just for fairness. There needs to be something. This is like, of course, if you are not a criminal, that's a different story. But if you're not, as the large majority of immigrants are not, I do believe in that. But then another point and again, I'm in agreement with David Bacon. Since 1986, which has been like, always remember as, I passed this large amnesty, that was the biggest amnesty that legalized some, I think, 4 million of immigrants at that time. Well, it also, for the first time, it introduced sanctions for employers. And this is like, on paper, the devil is in the details. I'm quoting, actually, one of the proponents of HB 56, because that's how he commented on the comprehensive immigration reform proposed by the Gang of Eight now. Yes, the devil is in the details even back then, because these employer sanctions actually, they're the only damaged really the workers, because then, it gives them obviously an excuse to say, well, I gotta let you go, I gotta lay you off. And so the way, again, those sanctions were envisioned to hurt the vulnerable people, not the employers. So until it's a crime to work, basically, you have a problem. So again, I don't know, there are, I think we gotta start with fair trade. With fair trade. We're having fair trade, obviously, with the free trade agreements. That's just because they're all pro-corporate displacing mechanisms. Yeah.
No, I don't know enough about the details of immigration reform. I would definitely say that any immigration reform would need to look at the roots of immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, just like, why are people moving? I mean, I'm hearing what you had to say, Sylvia, about like choice, but at the same time, what was the stat you shared about NAFTA? And
yeah, that's, I mean, well, that's something that, right now there are 11% of Mexicans are living in the U.S. I mean, people who are here, they're Mexican citizens. 11%. So it's a lot.
And before NAFTA?
Before NAFTA, and I'm still quoting David Bacon on this, it's like 4.5 millions of people, Mexicans, were here. So before 94, and now we have over 12 millions. So there's a cause-effect connection again and again. As I said, the whole thing about the choice is kind of a final disclaimer at the bottom line. People won't, you won't stop people from moving. I mean, we need to, in my ideal world, you will move towards the citizenship of residents. So after a little while, when wherever you live, that's where you have the right to vote. Because you gotta have a say, especially in local politics, but not only. I mean, I don't believe that it has to take you like forever to get voting rights, but that's right now it's utopia, but hopefully we get there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's like a minute till 3 minutes till 1 o'clock, so yeah, we should wrap up.
Is there
one more round of applause?